If you're looking to avoid some of the costly food storage mistakes, then this video is the right video for you. See, after spending 10 to 15 years as a prepper, I pretty much made every food storage mistake there is to make. And trust me, these mistakes weren't cheap either. They cost me in the thousands of dollars range over the course of years. Your food storage journey is going to look a whole lot different than mine. The space you have available, what you can afford, your skills in the kitchen, all of these are going to play a role in what the best foods to store for your individual situation are. Now, I wish I had all the resources that we have available today. All the great websites, all the great YouTube channels, all of this information that's readily available wasn't necessarily available back when I started. That's why today I want to share some types of foods that you should think twice about keeping in your prepper pantry. These are lessons learned from real experience and plenty of trial and error. Keep in mind, this is not to say that these foods don't have a place in your food storage, because they absolutely do, but they do need extra consideration for how much you decide to store and what some of the alternatives might be. After you watch the video, if you have any ideas or suggestions that might help other people, make sure and leave those in the comments below. The first category of foods to reconsider for your long-term storage might seem obvious, but it's something a lot of folks overlook. I'm talking about foods you don't normally eat. Now, you might be thinking, Dave, why would I store food I don't eat? And that's a fair question. The thing is, when we start prepping, we often get caught up in the idea of stockpiling as much as possible. We see those huge buckets of rice and beans and think, I need that. But the truth is, if you don't eat rice and beans regularly, you're not going to magically start enjoying them when the grid goes down. In fact, you might even find yourself trading them away for something more palatable. Your food storage is there to sustain you and your family during a crisis. It's not about having the most impressive stockpile on the block. It's about having food that you'll actually eat and that will provide you with the nutrition you need to get through a tough time. This doesn't mean you can't store some foods that you eat less frequently. Maybe you like to have a can of tuna once in a while, or you enjoy a bowl of oatmeal on a cold winter morning. There's nothing wrong with having some of these items on hand. The key is to be realistic about your eating habits and to focus on stocking up on the foods that you know you and your family will eat. This might mean buying smaller quantities of a wider variety of foods, or it might mean getting creative with your meal planning. For example, if you're not a big fan of plain rice, try adding different spices or seasonings to it. Or, if you're tired of beans, experiment with different recipes that use them in new and interesting ways. The most important thing is to eat what you store and store what you eat. If you don't eat those, they are all going to go bad. Make sure you're storing food that you're going to be able to inventory and rotate. This next one ties directly into the last one, and it's something I've learned the hard way. You need to be mindful of how complicated a meal is to make when you're considering long-term food storage. You see those just add water meals and they sound great in theory, but what about when you're in a real survival situation? Let's say you've got a limited fuel supply, your water situation is uncertain, and you're dealing with stress, limited daylight, and maybe even bad weather. Suddenly, that gourmet freeze-dried meal that requires precise measurements and boiling water for 20 minutes doesn't seem so appealing. Now, I'm not saying you can't have any of these types of meals in your prepper pantry. They can be great for morale or for a special occasion, but they shouldn't make up the bulk of your food storage. Instead, focus on simple, easy-to-prepare meals that require minimal cooking and few ingredients. Think about meals you can make in one pot over a fire, or things you can eat cold or with minimal heating. Things like rice, beans, lentils, oats, and pasta are all good options. They're relatively inexpensive, store well, and can be used in a variety of different dishes. Another important factor to consider is your skill level in the kitchen. If you're someone who enjoys cooking and experimenting with new recipes, then you might be comfortable with more complex meals in your food storage. But if you don't know how to make chili or put some recipes together, having those ingredients might be useless. In a disaster scenario, simpler approaches are often better. Stick to what you know and what you can realistically prepare under pressure. The less you have to think about cooking, the more time and energy you'll have to focus on other important tasks. Water-intensive foods. Water, the elixir of life, becomes even more precious during an emergency. That's why it's crucial to consider the water footprint of the foods in your prepper pantry, especially those you plan on storing long-term. You see, some foods like pasta, rice, and beans require a significant amount of water to cook properly. Now, this might not seem like a big deal when you've got access to running water, but in a grid-down situation, your water supply could be limited. Imagine this. You're rationing water carefully, making every drop count. The last thing you want to do is use up a large portion of your precious water supply just to cook a pot of rice. That's why it's smart to be mindful of water-intensive foods in your prepper pantry. Now, this doesn't mean you need to completely eliminate these foods from your storage. They're still valuable sources of carbohydrates and protein. However, it's important to balance them out with other options that require less water to prepare. For instance, instead of relying solely on pasta, consider incorporating more dehydrated or freeze-dried meals into your prepper pantry. These meals typically require less water for rehydration compared to cooking dried grains. Another approach is to explore no-cook or minimal-cook meal options. Think overnight oats, salads with canned protein sources, or sandwiches with shelf-stable spreads. These require little to no water for preparation, conserving your water supply for drinking and hygiene. Every drop counts in an emergency. By being mindful of the water footprint of your food choices, you can ensure you're stretching your resources as far as possible. Items like pasta and spaghetti require boiling water. You may want to ration water, so consider how much water your stored foods will need. Foods that need repackaging. Now let's talk about repackaging. You see those big bags of rice and beans or those bulk buckets of oats? They're economical, right? And they can last a good long while, but here's the catch. They often need to be repackaged for long-term storage. Now, I'm all for saving money and being resourceful, but repackaging takes time and effort. It requires the right supplies like oxygen absorbers and mylar bags to protect your food from moisture and pests. And let's be honest, not everyone enjoys spending their weekends portioning out bulk foods. It can be a tedious task, especially if you're dealing with a large quantity. So, before you fill your shopping cart with those bulk bargains, ask yourself, do you have the time, energy, and resources to repackage them properly? If you're new to prepping or short on time, you might find it more convenient to opt for pre-packaged, long-term food storage options. These often come in smaller, more manageable portions, ready for long-term storage without any extra work on your part. Now, if you enjoy the process of repackaging and find it therapeutic, by all means, go for those bulk buys. It can be a satisfying feeling to know you've prepared your food storage from start to finish. But if you're more interested in efficiency and ease, don't feel obligated to go the bulk route. Choose the option that best suits your lifestyle and resources. If you don't have the time or energy to repackage bulk foods into smaller portions, it might not be worth it. Consider the extra supplies and skills needed for repackaging. Large amounts of freezer food. Let's talk about a common mistake I see folks make, relying too heavily on freezer storage for their prepper pantry. Look, freezers are great. They allow us to stock up on fresh produce, meats, and even pre-made meals, but they're also entirely dependent on electricity. And when the grid goes down, so does your ability to keep those frozen goods from thawing out. Imagine this: a major storm hits, knocking out power for days, maybe even weeks. Your freezer, once a treasure trove of frozen delights, slowly begins to warm up. The food inside starts to thaw, and before you know it, you've got a soggy, potentially unsafe mess on your hands. That's the risk you run when you rely too heavily on freezer storage for your prepper pantry. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't use your freezer at all for food storage. It's a valuable tool when used strategically, but it shouldn't be your only line of defense. Instead, think of your freezer as a short-term storage solution. Use it to stock up on items you'll consume regularly, taking advantage of sales and seasonal produce. But when it comes to long-term food storage, diversify your approach. Incorporate shelf-stable options like canned goods, dried beans, rice, and other pantry staples. These foods don't require any special storage conditions and can last for years, providing you with peace of mind knowing you've got a reliable food source no matter what comes your way. If you don't have an energy source to run your freezer during a power outage, all that food will go to waste. Consider alternatives like canned or freeze-dried foods. When it comes to prepping, remember there's no one-size-fits-all approach. Your food storage is going to be different than everyone else's. Make sure you put together a plan that works best for you, taking into account your dietary needs, your resources, and your skill set. The most important rule is to store what you eat and eat what you store. Make sure you're inventorying and rotating through that food to avoid waste. It's about being prepared, not wasteful. And that's what prepping's all about, isn't it? It's about taking care of yourself and your loved ones when things get tough. If you have any questions or comments, make sure and leave them below. Subscribe to the channel, and until next time, take care and prepare.